I saw my wife go to a restaurant with her boss, so I went over and said, "Here's the divorce," leaving the paperwork on the table as a final point. She tried to justify it with her eyes, but the truth was already screaming too loudly. I left heartbroken, but with my dignity intact. It was in that moment that I knew, there was no going back. You can't come back from betrayal. You can't come back from the silence of someone who chose another embrace. And as much as it hurts, there's a line that, once crossed, there's no going back. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't scream. I didn't ask, why? The paper spoke for me. The ink, still fresh, trembled with the remnants of my hand holding the pen just minutes before crossing the street, entering that restaurant, and staring head-on at the image that would haunt me for the next few nights. The two of them sitting at the table, laughing. She with her hair tied up the way she always did when she wanted to appear more sophisticated. He with his hand too close to hers. There was no kiss, no explicit touching. But the betrayal was there, in the comfort of her smile, in the way she looked at him as if she had forgotten that there was someone on the other side of life waiting to have dinner with them at home. I didn't want revenge. It wasn't about that. It was about making it clear that I knew, that I had seen, and that I had no intention of fighting for what was already lost. It hurts when love ends, but it hurts even more when it still exists and still needs to be abandoned. And I loved her. Yes, I still loved her at that moment, and that was exactly what destroyed me. Betrayal is never just about the other person sleeping with someone else, but mainly about what it kills inside us, our value, our care, our memories. Everything we've built turns to rubble in seconds, and there's no warning when the person who swore to love you decides to silently love in another direction. She stared at me. Those eyes that once made me promise the world. They tried to tell me something. They tried to beg me not to do what I'd already done. But she said nothing. Neither did he. Shame left them both silent. And silence was the only answer I needed to understand that it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. She wasn't deceived, she didn't slip up. She went after it. She wanted it. And that's what corrodes the most, knowing you were replaced by choice, not by accident. I left. I breathed in the cold street air like someone in need of new lungs, because the one I had was no longer enough to handle the pain I carried. I walked without looking back. And I promised myself that, from that moment on, my life would be rebuilt with dignity, even if in pieces. The following days were a mixture of silence, suppressed anger, and damned longing. She tried to call me. Several times. She sent messages. I didn't answer any of them. Not out of pride, but out of respect for the grief I needed to experience. I had lost someone who was still alive, and that is a cruel kind of death. No one sends flowers to a heart that has been betrayed. No one says, "My condolences," when love is stabbed by the one you believed would hold your hand until the end. Betrayal has its own smell, a bitter taste that won't go away even after gallons of coffee and sleepless nights. People asked what had happened. I just said, "It's over." Because explaining requires reliving. And I was still trying to survive. She tried to justify it. She said it was a moment, that nothing really happened, that it was just dinner. But it wasn't just dinner. It was a breach of trust. It was a symbol of neglect. It was proof that she could do what she did even knowing what we had. And even if it hadn't gone beyond that, and I doubt it, it was enough to destroy everything. Because when you love someone, even the thought of another is a stab in the back. And she didn't just think. She went. She left the house, got ready, looked in the mirror, and chose to go out with me waiting. She chose to experience a date while our relationship was dying inside. I continued. Little by little. First organizing my clothes, then trying to eat properly, then trying to sleep. The worst part isn't being alone, it's feeling abandoned even when you have someone. And after she left, I realized I'd been alone for a long time. Her presence was no longer company, it was absence disguised as routine. And, in the midst of this whole process, I found a new way of existing. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't magical. But, little by little, I rediscovered myself. I started walking. Talking to people. Remembering who I was before I became just a reflection of the two of us. And that's when someone appeared. A woman who didn't come to fill a void, but to remind me that I was still whole. That there was still respect. That there was still love that didn't need guarding. That it was still possible to look at someone and feel peace, not doubt. And, over time, that peace turned into affection. Affection, caring. Caring, presence. And presence, a new love. I didn't need to force myself. I didn't need to hide my pain. She didn't ask me for explanations. She just listened. She just stayed. Meanwhile, the other woman, the one who betrayed me, began to appear again. With more insistence. With more guilt in her voice. With more urgency in her eyes. She came to my door one night. She said she regretted it, that she realized what she'd lost, that she even missed my flaws. I listened silently. There was no more anger. There was no more love. Only memory. Only the echo of something that had already passed. I said I forgave her. Yes, I did. Not for her, but for myself. So I could move on without carrying the weight of hate. But forgiving isn't forgetting. And forgiving isn't going back either. I said this looking into her eyes. I saw the world crumble there. I saw the exact second she understood she'd lost something she'd never find again anywhere. That the kind of love she'd thrown away doesn't come twice in a lifetime. And that, this time, it wasn't she who was being left behind. It was she who watched, with pain, as life went on, without her. But the cruelest thing in life isn't when someone betrays you. It's when they realize what they've destroyed, too late. And she understood this. She understood it all on her own. Without letters. Without explanations. Without any chances. She understood that the problem with playing with true love is that once it's gone, it doesn't come back. And when she saw my new relationship blossom, with tenderness, truth, and loyalty, she realized there was no room for regret in the life of someone who had already started over. And then, one random night, she dreamed of the life we could have had. With children. With travel. With lazy Sunday afternoons. With laughter in the kitchen. She woke up alone. Without the smell of coffee. Without footsteps in the hallway. Without voices. And she realized, there, between cold sheets and warm memories, that the dreams she'd had of me died along with the choice she made that night. The choice to cheat. But the story doesn't end there. Because not everything that hurts, ends. And there was one last thing she did, one last unexpected gesture, that changed everything. And that's why this story needs to be told to the end. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized that we do not support, justify, or cover up for those who destroy the hearts of those who have trusted us. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths, because they show how a wrong choice can ruin everything that was real. Get ready to dive into an intense, exciting and shocking, take a deep breath, the story is about to begin. Daniel and Clara met on a warm March afternoon, one of those banal encounters that only make sense when viewed from a distance of years. She was distractedly serving customers in a small neighborhood bookstore, a pencil tucked into her makeshift bun, her eyes buried in a worn-cover novel. He went in looking for a last-minute gift for his sister's birthday and left with a wrapped book and a number scrawled on a bookmark. The exchange of glances was shy, almost unpretentious, but it was enough to plant something that would grow unexpectedly. From that moment on, their story began to unfold in comfortable silences, knowing laughter, and small daily discoveries. They were in no rush. Daniel had just been promoted at the consulting firm where he worked, and Clara taught literature to teenagers at a private school. They both carried different emotional baggage, but there was something in the way they looked at each other that made it seem as if they had finally found a kind of peaceful resting place after so many failed attempts. The apartment they decided to live in together after 2 years of dating was on the 3rd floor of an old building, with windows that creaked in the wind and a timid view of a park. Clara liked to wake up before dawn and make coffee while listening to Ella Fitzgerald at a low volume, while Daniel took his time getting out of bed, always taking a few extra minutes to smell the coffee wafting through the room. Their routine was simple, almost poetic. There was no luxury, but there was dedication. They didn't have much money, but they had plans. They dreamed of a bigger house, a trip to Tuscany, maybe a dog, maybe a child, but not now, they said. There was still time. They liked to walk together on Sundays, visit second-hand bookshops and craft fairs, laugh at the same silly movies, and exchange messages during work hours just to say, "I was thinking of you." And even on days when they disagreed over small things, like the wet towel on the bed or the dishes forgotten in the sink, there was always room for an apology and a sweet reconciliation on the living room couch. Daniel was a man of discreet habits. Hard-working, loyal, and affectionate in his own way. He had a sense of responsibility that sometimes bordered on exaggeration, but Clara admired that about him. She saw him as an anchor, someone she could count on even when everything around her was falling apart. She, however, was driven by a sensitivity that sometimes made her overly demanding of the world and of herself. She had anxiety attacks before meetings, cried at emotional commercials, and worried about the future more than she should have. But Daniel calmed her. He would touch her hand, smile, and say, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be you." And in those moments, she believed everything would be okay. Between them, there was respect. And, for a long time, there also seemed to be a kind of quiet love that made no fuss but filled every space. Friends considered them the ideal couple. They were discreet on social media, but visibly happy in real life. They never made a scene in public, never fought at family gatherings, never exposed their pain. They saved their conflicts for the right moments, away from the eyes of others. Clara often said she loved the way Daniel listened to her, even when she thought she was exaggerating. And he, in turn, said that what he admired most about her was the way she saw beauty in everything, even cloudy days. They weathered small crises together, like the day their car broke down in the middle of the road or when Clara lost a job opportunity due to a panic attack. But they always knew how to navigate these difficulties hand in hand, without assigning blame. They shared more than just a roof over their heads, they shared hopes, frustrations, childhood stories, old scars, and plans that still had no name. Their love, at that moment, was something you could see in the details, in the way she left a note in his lunchbox or how he'd go get ice cream at 3 in the morning when she said she was craving it. But there was also the subtle wear and tear that comes with time. That which isn't announced, but insinuates itself between the lines of routine. Eyes began to linger a little longer before meeting. Evening conversations gave way to longer silences. Work began to demand more of Daniel, and Clara seemed increasingly immersed in a restlessness he couldn't fully understand. The laughter was still there, but it came less frequently. There was still love, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had changed, though neither of them knew exactly what. She started coming home from school later, he started traveling more frequently for meetings. Sundays lost some of their sparkle, the walks became fewer, and the notes were replaced by quick messages on his cell phone. They looked at each other, but they no longer saw each other with the same clarity. Daniel noticed, but didn't know how to approach her. He didn't want to seem controlling, didn't want to invade her space. He preferred to believe it was just a phase. Every relationship has its ups and downs, he thought. Meanwhile, Clara seemed torn between the life they'd built together and a growing anxiety over something she couldn't quite name. Sometimes she'd spend hours staring into space, lost in thought. Other times, she'd be loving and present, like in the old days, trying to recapture her former lightness. Daniel, for his part, struggled to maintain their connection. He'd bring her flowers for no reason, prepare impromptu dinners, make plans for the next holiday. But there was a shadow in her gaze that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. And, little by little, a silent uneasiness took hold of him, a nagging premonition he struggled to ignore. Still, there was hope. There were days when everything seemed to return to normal. A breakfast filled with laughter, a movie night on the couch with blankets and popcorn, an impromptu dance in the kitchen. Moments when the outside world seemed distant and their love still made sense. But these moments began to feel less spontaneous, more forced. As if they were desperate attempts to piece together something that was already falling apart. And, even without knowing exactly why, Daniel began to feel something pulling them apart, something invisible, but present. Clara, for her part, felt increasingly burdened by the guilt of not being able to be completely happy with what, in theory, was all she'd ever wanted. Daniel's love was strong, genuine, but perhaps, too predictable for someone who sought to feel the world intensely. She blamed herself for this, hated admitting, even to herself, that something was missing. But the dissatisfaction grew, silent. Sometimes she would look at him sleeping and wonder if she still loved him as before, or if she was just trying to preserve what remained of a beautiful story. She felt ungrateful for this. He was good, caring, present. But for some reason, that part of her that yearned for something more life, more emotion, more meaning, seemed to scream louder and louder. They continued like this for a few more months, pretending not to notice the cracks slowly opening. Pretending everything was still as it had been. But the truth, like an undercurrent, was already beginning to erode the foundations of what had seemed so solid. And even as they tried to cling to what remained, something bigger, inevitable, was approaching. A breaking point. A choice. A pain that still had no name, but would soon take shape. And when she took it, nothing would be the same again. Clara began to change slowly, like someone who turns their face away for a few seconds and, upon looking back, realizes that everything around them is no longer in place. The mornings became quieter. The coffees I used to delicately prepare were forgotten on the counter. The tickets I used to leave disappeared as if they had never existed. Daniel noticed. He felt. But he said nothing. He believed crises existed and that love would endure if it were real. He tried to justify to himself that the stress of her work was more intense, that perhaps the demands of school, the pedagogical meetings, the restless teenagers, and the expectations of the coordinator were draining her energy. He was trying to understand, as he always had. He tried to be the harbor. But she no longer docked. Their conversations became short. Her gaze grew increasingly distant, her mind wandering as he talked about his day. Monosyllabic responses, smiles that seemed more like polite gestures than expressions of affection, constant distractions with his cell phone. She was there, but she wasn't. Daniel, even feeling this distance, still struggled to reverse time, to relearn the path to her. He booked a weekend for a short trip, organized everything himself, chose a bed and breakfast in the countryside, near a stream where she said she felt at peace. But she refused. She said she had a school event, an unavoidable commitment to her job as a director. She apologized, said she would make it up to him. He believed her. He wanted to believe. Because love, sometimes, is also choosing to ignore obvious signs in the hope that time will reconfigure what was lost. That Saturday night, Daniel watched a movie alone, with the dinner he'd planned for them. He scrolled through old photos on his phone, remembering how happy they'd once been in small moments. He tried to understand what had changed, at what point the distance had crept in without warning. He didn't suspect anything concrete. Not yet. But restlessness was a beast that stalked his nights, his thoughts, his periods of silence. He began to notice details he'd previously ignored. The messages she'd received and quickly hidden. The new perfume she'd started wearing without comment. The bolder clothes for a simple school day. And there was also the laughter. A new, different laughter that emerged when she'd been using her phone while lying on the sofa, facing away from him. One night, she arrived later than usual. She said she'd gone to dinner with the school staff, an informal get-together among teachers. Daniel didn't say anything, but there was a scent he didn't recognize. Something stronger than Clara's usual scents. A faint hint of a masculine perfume mingled with hers, perhaps from the environment, perhaps from someone too close. He didn't want to suspect. Not yet. But his mind began to work on its own, creating scenarios, retracing steps, deconstructing recent memories in search of flaws, of clues. Even so, he decided to remain silent. He wanted proof before confronting, he wanted certainty before destroying what could still be saved. The following days became a constant dance between pretense and frustration. She was more absent than ever, always with a reason not to have dinner together, always with some last-minute commitment. Daniel tried to maintain his balance, but her every gesture seemed too slippery, too distant. One random Tuesday, she left too early and left her cell phone at home. A rare oversight. He saw it on the dresser and, for a few seconds, was frozen in desperate hesitation. He felt like he was invading something that wasn't his, but he also knew that perhaps there lay the answer to all the silences that were killing him inside. The screen lit up with notifications from a fixed conversation. A name saved with an emoji. He didn't read it all. He didn't need to. 2 sentences at the top of the screen were enough to confirm what his heart had already understood weeks ago. Intimate words. An invitation to their next meeting. A reminder of something that happened the Saturday she said she had a school commitment. Daniel didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't break anything. He just sat on the edge of the bed, his phone in his hands, his entire body filled with a calm that only profound disappointment can cause. The feeling of watching something you fought to keep standing crumble. The kind of pain that has no sound, but deafens. When she returned and found the phone in the same place, nothing was said. He simply looked at her differently. She noticed, but pretended not to notice. She carried on as if everything was normal, as if there weren't cracks everywhere. In the following days, Daniel changed. He became more distant, more observant. He started going out more, not letting her know where he was. A silent game took place. And yet, paradoxical as it was, he still slept beside her, his heart squeezed between the memory of what they had been and the reality of what they were becoming. The following Friday, he left work early. He had a feeling. Something inside him told him that day needed to be different. Clara had said she would stay late at school for a planning meeting. Daniel drove there, but the parking lot was practically empty. He waited for a few minutes, watching the school entrance, but nothing. Then he left. He took a different street, heading in no particular direction. Until he saw her. Not at school. But sitting at a table near the window of a restaurant they both knew well. She wasn't alone. She was with him. The man with the emoji. The other one. Daniel parked the car slowly, as if he didn't want the pain to show in sudden movements. He entered the restaurant quietly. He walked to the table as if walking to a verdict, but without hesitation. She saw him before he could say anything. His face froze, as if the world around him had stopped for a moment. The other man lowered his gaze. Clara tried to open her mouth, but no words came out. Daniel then, without shouting, without hesitation, placed a folder of documents on the table. He simply said that the divorce was here. And that she didn't need to lie anymore. There was no scene. There was no drama. Just a sentence, a signature, and a devastating silence. She tried to say something with her eyes. She tried to justify it. But the truth was already there, between them, with a weight that no explanation could ease. He left the restaurant without looking back. His heart was bleeding, but his steps carried the dignity of someone who had been hurt but had not lost their self-respect. That night, Clara returned home and found the ring left on the nightstand. The room was dark, cold, empty. And for the first time in a long time, she felt fear. Real fear. Fear that she had made a choice she could never go back from. What she didn't know, was that the betrayal was just the beginning. There was something more. Something she never imagined would come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. Clara spent the days following the divorce as if walking through a minefield of memories. The apartment, now empty, seemed to amplify every sound, every echo of footsteps, every creak of the door, as if the silence cruelly screamed Daniel's absence. There was no longer the smell of coffee in the morning, nor the sound of the keyboard in the background as he worked, nor the notes left on the table with simple but affectionate phrases. Everything was now cold, impersonal, as if life had left the space with him. The emptiness was physical, sharp, present in every corner. Clara tried to maintain her routine, but it no longer made sense. She spent hours in front of the mirror trying to understand what she had done, how she had allowed everything to fall apart like that. Why had she chosen the ephemeral when she had the eternal by her side? Why had she traded what was solid for something that, now, she no longer knew was real? The other man, the one who had occupied her mind for weeks, no longer responded as frequently. She'd begun to withdraw after the divorce, as if conquest had lost its charm when it was no longer forbidden. Clara realized this, but couldn't admit it out loud. She, who had had everything, now found herself alone, drowning in guilt and shame. Meanwhile, Daniel didn't stop. He didn't stagnate. He didn't fall into the abyss she expected him to. Quite the contrary. He resumed his life with a quiet strength. He reconnected with old friends, started running in the park again, and started attending social events he'd always put off before. And it was on one of those quiet afternoons, in a carefree conversation with colleagues at work, that he met Sophia. She was a woman with a light laugh and a steady gaze, someone who knew how to listen and speak with equal intensity. Different from Clara in many ways, but surprisingly compatible in others. Sophia didn't want to heal wounds, she wanted to build something new, without rushing, without empty promises. Daniel, still scarred by what he'd experienced, kept his distance at first, but gradually he began to let himself go. Their conversations evolved into dates, their dates into dinners, and their dinners into complicity. There was no rush, but there was truth. And in the midst of it all, Clara watched from afar. She found out through a mutual friend. She saw the photos on social media. Her heart sank, but she didn't dare interrupt. Until one day, months later, she decided to seek him out. She didn't know exactly what she wanted. She wasn't expecting reconciliation. Maybe she just wanted to ask for forgiveness, maybe just to see up close the man who was now moving on without her. Daniel agreed to the meeting, out of curiosity or a need for closure. They met at a discreet cafe, far from the places they'd frequented together. When she arrived, he was already there, with a calm expression, no hurt in his eyes, but also without the old sparkle. She sat across from him, took a deep breath, and began to talk. She said she regretted it, that she missed not only him, but who she was when they were together. That she had made the biggest mistake of her life by confusing stability with routine. That she had sought excitement elsewhere when, in truth, what she needed was to take care of what she already had. Daniel listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he simply said he already knew. That it wasn't hatred he felt anymore, but a kind of resigned sadness. That he didn't wish any harm, but that what they had died the moment she chose to walk out the door and lie about where she was. She asked for forgiveness. He said he had already forgiven her. That forgiveness was so he could move on in peace, not so they could get back together. She didn't insist. She simply lowered her eyes and whispered, "I understand." But before they said goodbye, Daniel took a deep breath and said there was something she needed to know. Something he hadn't told her, not out of revenge or pride, but because he felt there was no point in bringing it up before. But now, there, face to face, after everything, it seemed only right that she know. He said that the day he walked into that restaurant, divorce papers in hand, he already knew. That he wasn't there by chance. It wasn't an impulse. He'd received an anonymous message with a photo of her and the other man. The image left no doubt. But what Clara didn't know was who had sent it. Daniel, in a calm voice, explained that the sender of the message was someone unexpected, the other man's sister. A woman who knew Clara from afar, from school end-of-year parties and corporate events, and who recognized her at the restaurant. She knew who she was, understood what was happening, and decided, out of empathy, to warn him. Clara's eyes widened. She began connecting the dots. His sister. She never suspected it was someone close. Daniel then said that the woman had written, along with the photo, just one sentence: "You deserve to know who you're sleeping with." But that wasn't all. There was more. The real impact was yet to come. Daniel looked into her eyes and, with a choked voice, added that, in the same week everything happened, he'd received another piece of information. Something he hadn't had the courage to confront until that moment. But now it was there, pulsing between them. He said that night at the dinner, Clara hadn't just cheated. She'd done something even crueler: she'd lied to someone in her own family to cover up the encounter. She'd told her mother she was traveling to a conference and asked her not to call her for 2 days. But her mother fell ill that morning and tried calling her several times. When she got no answer, she called Daniel, who, worried, went to his mother-in-law's house and took her to the hospital. Clara began to tremble. Her hands were sweating. She knew about the hospitalization incident, but she thought it had all happened at another time. She never knew her mother had tried to call her during dinner with the other man. Daniel said that while she was eating and laughing with someone behind his back, he was sitting in a hospital waiting room, holding her mother's hand, comforting a woman who was crying, not knowing where her daughter was. And that night, while the most important woman in Clara's life was battling a heart attack, she had turned off her cell phone so as not to be disturbed. The revelation hit like a blow. Clara burst into tears. She began to babble that she didn't know, that she had no idea this was happening. But Daniel interrupted her, saying the problem wasn't that she didn't know, it was that she had unnecessarily lied. That she had created a parallel story to live something forbidden, without thinking of the consequences. Clara tried to explain herself, tried to apologize again. But her words came out jumbled, desperate. Daniel simply stood up, leaving an envelope on the table. Inside were the messages exchanged between him and the other man's sister, the photo from the restaurant, the medical report with her mother's name as her companion, and the note he'd written that morning while waiting for her to wake up. A note never delivered, which read, "If you only knew where I was last night, maybe you would have looked at me with less of a rush to leave." Clara stood there, alone, with the papers in her hands and her soul shattered. For the first time, she understood the true weight of her own choices. It wasn't just love she lost, it was trust, respect, and the chance to mend what had been broken. And, more than anything, she realized she had hurt not only those who loved her, but those who never deserved to be part of this pain. Betrayal had been a mistake. But what she did with her silence, that was unforgivable. And Daniel, for the first time, knew he had done the right thing by not returning. Because there was pain that love cannot heal. Clara couldn't get up from the table. Her legs felt rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the envelope that weighed more than any sentence. The coffee shop around her continued its muffled normalcy, cups clinking, voices scattered, baristas calling names indifferently. But for her, time had stopped. Each piece of paper Daniel had left there was a sharp blade cutting away a piece of her self-image. Awareness no longer came as guilt, but as an avalanche. She wasn't just the woman who betrayed the man who loved her. She was also the daughter who lied to her own mother in a moment of vulnerability. The woman who chose ego, impulse, distraction. She tried to control her tears, but her chest felt like it was about to burst. She brought her hands to her face, trying to hide her internal collapse, as if she could protect her dignity with her trembling palms. Around her, a few glances glanced, briefly, curiously, but then quickly averted. No one there knew she was standing before the rubble of her own life. She left the coffee shop with slow steps, feeling the weight of the envelope pressing down on her purse as if it held within it all the mistakes that could no longer be erased. When she reached her car, she didn't start the engine. She stood there, motionless, staring at the steering wheel, trying to remember when her life had turned this way. The memory of the night she'd hung up the phone, believing she was doing something liberating, now mingled with the muffled sound of her mother's voice trying to tell her she had chest pain. She didn't answer. She preferred not to be interrupted. She thought she could deal with everything later. But later had arrived, and it was too late. She picked up her cell phone, looked up her mother's number, and called, even though she knew it would be difficult. The call went to voicemail. She tried twice more. Nothing. She took a deep breath, started the car, and drove to her mother's house. Upon arriving, she was greeted with a cold stare. The woman who had always welcomed her with lingering hugs now kept her arms crossed, her body leaning against the door like an invisible barrier. Clara asked to come in. Her mother hesitated, but made room. They sat in the living room, on a sofa that for so many years had been the scene of intimate conversations, but now felt like a trench. Clara began to speak, without hiding, without trying to sugarcoat it. She told him about the betrayal, about the dinner, about the disconnected phone. He said he hadn't known the gravity of the situation, but now he understood. That he was ashamed. That he would give anything to go back in time and do things differently. His mother, silent, watched her with teary but steady eyes. When Clara finished, there was a long silence. And then her mother's voice, trembling and low, crossed the space between them like a pained whisper, "I didn't need you to be perfect, Clara. I just wanted to know my daughter was still there when I needed her." That sentence was a mirror she didn't want to look at. Her mother's pain didn't stem from marital betrayal, but from her absence when she needed it most. Clara tried to get closer, held her mother's hand, but there was no reciprocation. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not now. She left feeling heavier than ever. For the first time, she understood that the choices we make in search of freedom, when made irresponsibly, can imprison far more than they liberate. In the days that followed, she tried to live. She went to work. She tried to smile. She tried to eat. But everything seemed tasteless, colorless, and purposeless. She happened to see a photo of Daniel at a charity event on social media. He was with Sophia. There was no ostentation, no romantic poses. But there was peace. A serene expression on his face that Clara hadn't seen in a long time. She realized, without anyone needing to tell her, that that man no longer belonged to her. That his presence in her life was now just a memory. What still existed was respect. He didn't speak ill of her to anyone. He didn't try to portray himself as a victim. He just lived. And that hurt more than any scream of hatred could. In an attempt to reassemble the pieces of herself, Clara sought therapy. She knew she could no longer hide behind excuses, that there were no shortcuts out of where she was. Little by little, she revisited her mistakes, facing the hard truths she had always avoided. She understood that the emptiness that had driven her into the arms of another man was not Daniel's fault, but an unresolved restlessness within herself, an insatiable search for validation, for emotion, for something to fill what she herself couldn't name. It was months of silent reconstruction, of nights crying alone, of unappetizing dinners, and of frustrated attempts to reconnect with her mother. Until, one gray autumn afternoon, Clara decided to write a letter. Not to apologize, she'd already done that. But to thank him. She sat at the living room table, took a deep breath, and began writing to Daniel. She told him she now understood his silence, that she understood why he never exploded, never demanded anything, never asked for an explanation. He already knew he'd lost something precious, but he chose to leave with the dignity she hadn't. She said she admired the way he started over, how he didn't allow her mistake to turn him bitter. She said she wished, with all her heart, for him to be happy with Sophia. And that, even with everything, she remembered the good times fondly. She didn't ask for a return visit, didn't ask for contact. She simply sealed the envelope, dropped it in a mailbox, and moved on. Time passed. Clara moved house. She gradually rekindled her relationship with her mother. Not completely, but enough for them to begin rebuilding. The wound still hurt, but it no longer bled as much. She learned to accept that certain marks remain to remember, not to punish. He returned to teaching literature with more passion than before. In class, he spoke about love, about mistakes, about redemption. Not as someone who read about it in books, but as someone who had experienced it firsthand. And it was in this true place that he found meaning. Sometimes, she saw couples on the street and remembered Daniel. Not with longing, but with respect. He was, indeed, the great love of her life. And she knew she had lost him through a stupid choice. A single night that cost years of trust. Years later, in a local bookstore, Clara ran into Daniel again. It was by chance. He was looking for a gift for his niece. She was leafing through a book of poetry. When their eyes met, there was an awkward silence at first. But then, a slight smile from both of them. They talked for a few minutes. He told her about his new life, she talked about her work. Neither of them mentioned the past. It was as if that reunion were a period that time needed to put an end to. When they said goodbye, Clara held his gaze for a few seconds. And in that look, there was something inexplicable in words. It wasn't desire. Nor pain. It was simply gratitude. For everything that was, and for everything that wasn't. That day, returning home, Clara lay in bed and, for the first time in a long time, felt at peace. Not because she had regained anything. But because, finally, she had forgiven herself. She knew she would never get back what she had destroyed, but she also knew she had learned, the hard way, the value of true love. And that if I ever loved again, I would do it differently. Not because I wanted to avoid the pain, but because I now knew how hard it is to lose someone who truly loves you. What Daniel gave him, no other man could. Loyalty without demands. Love without games. Truth without masks. And this, she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not as regret, but as a lesson learned. And it was there, in that moment when pain became memory and memory became a lesson, that Clara understood what it truly means to mature. It's not just growing up. It's acknowledging one's own mistakes, bearing the weight of the consequences, and still moving forward. Without expecting a fresh start, without wishing for shortcuts. Just moving forward. Because some stories, no matter how beautiful, end. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is accepting that ending with humility. In the days following their unexpected reunion at the bookstore, Clara carried a strange feeling in her chest, not sadness, nor joy, but something denser and harder to name, as if she were slowly digesting the last piece of a puzzle that had taken years to assemble. The smile they exchanged in that brief moment didn't erase the pain they'd experienced, nor the mistakes they'd made, but there was something about it that made it clear, the wounds had healed, and now, what remained was a silent respect for the path each had chosen to follow. However, as much as time had played its healing role, the choices that led to the ruin of that love still echoed in the quietest corners of her conscience. Life hadn't punished her with eternal loneliness, nor with regrets that would prevent her from living, but it had gifted her with a full awareness of the consequences, and with it, the weight of knowing that not everything can be fixed. There was acceptance, yes, but there was also a bitter learning curve, one that shaped her way of seeing the world, of loving, of acting. Clara began to live with greater presence. The little things, the smell of freshly brewed tea, the texture of the pages of a new book, the unpretentious conversation with coworkers, became more intense, as if she needed to extract some kind of daily redemption from them. She returned to teaching with greater depth, and her students began to listen to her more attentively, perhaps because she no longer spoke just about literature, but about life. Her way of interpreting characters changed. Classic tragedies that once seemed distant now had an intimate flavor, a direct reflection of what she had experienced firsthand. Her eyes sparkled when she spoke of regret, of loss, of the decisions that seemed small but changed everything, and, without realizing it, she became more human before them, more genuine. Meanwhile, Daniel was moving forward on a different journey. With Sophia, he discovered a kind of love that didn't require vigilance, that didn't leave him on constant alert, as if something could collapse at any moment. It was a love built on the lightness of conversations after a long day, on the confidence of knowing that, even when she was distant, she was still there, whole and whole. Sophia didn't demand a past that wasn't hers, and Daniel, in turn, didn't try to replicate the molds of what he'd already experienced. They moved naturally, respecting each other's time, silences, and spaces. But despite his serenity, he also carried the weight of an inner transformation. The betrayal he suffered didn't transform him into someone distrustful, but into someone more aware of his own limits. He learned that love isn't enough without reciprocity, and that loyalty must be mutual, not just expected. He didn't harbor anger toward Clara, but also knew that if he had ignored the signs, he might now be a man trapped in a dying relationship, swallowed by his own denial. Life now placed them on parallel paths, but every now and then, their worlds would intersect. At social events, at school reunions, or even in public places by chance. Whenever this happened, there was mutual respect. Neither of them forced a rapprochement, but there was no discomfort either. Just a silent understanding that each was following their own path, and that the past, though painful, had taught them enough to take the next steps more consciously. However, not everyone around them understood this dynamic. Some mutual friends questioned how Daniel could be so cordial with Clara, and he patiently replied that there were things that couldn't be carried forever. That forgiveness is not a gift to the other, but a liberation for those who choose to live without the burden of resentment. Clara, for her part, faced more complex internal dilemmas. As much as she had accepted that Daniel had moved on, there were days when the memory of what she had destroyed would arise uninvited, especially when she saw happy couples in simple moments, like holding hands in silence or smiling as they shared an ice cream on the street. In those moments, the pain returned, not as self-pity, but as longing for a version of herself that knew how to love properly. A love she now only recognized in others. She had not yet been able to commit herself to a new relationship. She had had a few attempts, encounters, brief connections, but none of them deep enough to blossom. Partly because she compared. Partly because she was still rebuilding herself. And, most importantly, because she knew that until she completely forgave herself, she would not be able to give back to someone what had once been broken. This process of self-discovery inevitably led her to a moral dilemma she couldn't easily resolve. In her classes, when discussing guilt, regret, and redemption, students brought up personal issues, became emotional about the topics, and Clara saw herself reflected in them. She realized how each human being carries their own flaws, their own attempts to get things right. She began to question, to what extent does a mistake define a person? How many chances does someone deserve in life? And, above all, how could she teach empathy when she herself struggled daily to forgive herself? This dilemma became so prevalent that it became a topic of debate in class. Her students, unaware of her story, told her that everyone deserves a fresh start. That no one is what they did wrong, but what they choose to do after they make a mistake. Clara listened silently, absorbing those words as lessons in return. And, little by little, she found some comfort in this new way of seeing herself. As time passed, the relationship with her mother grew stronger. It wasn't the same as before, but there was affection, there was care, there was conversation. Clara's mother, now more fragile, began to age more visibly, and this awakened in Clara a new sense of emotional responsibility. She visited her frequently, helped with small tasks, and listened attentively to stories that would previously have seemed repetitive. This rapprochement wasn't motivated by guilt, but by the choice to do the right thing while there was still time. And this transformed her more than any punishment could. Because, deep down, Clara understood that it wasn't enough to acknowledge the mistake, she had to choose, every day, not to repeat it. And this choice required attention, effort, and humanity. Daniel, on the other hand, was preparing for a new step. He considered making his relationship with Sophia official, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he felt he had found a new peace. Before making any decisions, however, he decided to talk to his therapist about the past. He didn't want to enter a new stage of life carrying traces of what was left behind. In that conversation, he understood that there's no way to love someone fully if parts of you still struggle with unresolved memories. It was then that he wrote a letter, not to Clara, not to Sophia, but to himself. A kind of silent manifesto where he said that, although he still remembered, it no longer hurt. That the pain of the end had turned to respect, and that love, even though betrayed, left in him the mark of something that truly existed. This inner shift had a practical effect. Daniel's serenity grew. Sophia noticed. She asked, affectionately, what had changed. And he replied, with a light smile, that now, yes, he was whole. There were no more rough edges. Nothing pending. Nothing to be said. That the past had been closed like a book that, though important, no longer needed to be reread. And it was with this maturity that he proposed. A simple, unostentatious proposal, made on an ordinary afternoon, while they were washing the dishes together. Sophia cried, said yes, and they both laughed like those who understand that happiness, sometimes, resides right there, in the little things. Clara learned of the engagement from a friend. The news came like a whisper. She paused for a few seconds, closed her eyes, and smiled. A sad smile, but full of tenderness. She didn't feel jealous. She didn't feel envy. She felt gratitude. And, more than that, she felt proud that he had been strong enough to move on, to avoid becoming a hostage to a story that didn't end well. She took out an old notebook and wrote, "The love of my life is marrying someone else. And I'm at peace with that. Because I lost him for something I chose to do. And he taught me, even in our goodbyes, what it means to love truly." These words, scrawled in the silence of the night, were not a confession, but a liberation. Clara knew that from then on, she could begin a new chapter. One where she wouldn't seek love to feel whole, but where she would love with more maturity, more care, more truth. She no longer needed Daniel's presence to be better. He had been part of her story, but now, she was becoming the protagonist of her own redemption. And there was still much to live for. Time, patient as ever, was preparing to close this cycle. But there was still one last twist, something unexpected, a simple gesture that would change the course of everything once again. It was early autumn when Clara finally decided to reorganize the shelves in her old living room, which for months had become nothing more than a silent repository of stacked books, overturned paintings, and memories she'd preferred to avoid. That cloudy afternoon had a melancholic air she'd learned not to fear. She'd grown accustomed to living in her own company and, curiously, no longer felt the weight of loneliness as before. The silence was no longer the absence of something or someone, it was her own presence. As she dusted off the books and rearranged the covers by author, she found a forgotten box at the back of the closet, inside it, old clippings, faded photographs, and, at the bottom, an old diary, the kind where Clara used to jot down ideas for classes, reading lists, and travel plans that never happened. As she flipped through the pages, she came across notes from a specific year, the year it all happened. And there, among scribbles and phrases that at the time seemed commonplace, she found one that made her stop. "If I lose Daniel, it will be my fault, and I will have to learn to live with that." That sentence, written months before the betrayal, sounded like a silent prophecy that she, unconsciously, already carried. She sat on the living room floor, diary on her lap, eyes brimming with tears. The life she'd rebuilt was far from perfect, but it was real. And in this reality, there was room for regrets that no longer suffocated, but merely reminded her. She picked up her phone, looked at Daniel's number still saved in her contacts. She ran her thumb over it, hesitated. She didn't want to say anything, had nothing to ask. But there was something inside her, a restlessness difficult to translate. It wasn't missing him, it was missing a version of herself that only existed by his side. The message she ended up writing was simple: "Today I found a piece of myself that I left in the past. Thank you for being part of the best of me." She didn't expect a reply. She didn't need one. It was a gesture that closed a cycle. The message was sent and deleted soon after, like a whisper thrown into the wind, for only time to hear. The following week, Clara received an unexpected invitation. A schoolmate who was also a friend of Sophia's invited her to an art exhibition that Sophia had helped organize, along with Daniel, for a charity campaign. For a moment, she hesitated. Going might have seemed invasive, out of place. But something made her accept. Perhaps the desire to see up close the new life she had previously only known through photos and stories. Upon arriving at the gallery, she was greeted kindly. The atmosphere was light, filled with hushed conversations, wines being served in discreet glasses, and canvases bursting with color. The art seemed to tell stories Clara didn't know she needed to hear. She was walking among the works when she spotted Daniel in the distance. He was alone, observing an abstract painting, his hands in his pockets, his posture calm. Clara approached slowly. He noticed her before she could say anything and waved with a gentle smile. Their reunion was brief. They talked about the exhibition and exchanged compliments on the organization. Clara said little, but listened attentively. And that's when Daniel, unexpectedly, brought up a topic she hadn't expected. "You said you'd read the message. That, even though it was erased, it had arrived in time. And that, of all the words she'd ever said to you, that was the one that touched you most. Not because of guilt, but because of recognition." Clara didn't know what to say immediately. Her eyes filled with tears, but she hid them. They laughed together, not at any joke, but at the relief of knowing the past could finally stop being an open wound. When Sophia approached, Clara greeted her naturally. There was no awkwardness, no tension. Just a respectful gesture between two women who, for different reasons, knew the same man completely. That night was the last time Clara and Daniel saw each other in person. After that, their lives followed definitively separate paths. He immersed himself in wedding preparations, she became increasingly involved in the school's social projects, organizing book clubs for vulnerable students. But there was one final connection, a gesture that would bring everything to a definitive and unexpectedly beautiful close. One of Clara's students, an introspective and intelligent teenager, wrote an essay for a literary competition. The theme was, "Who Changed My Way of Seeing the World?" The essay was about Clara. He talked about how her classes helped him understand that we are not defined by the worst day of our lives, and that everyone carries scars that can become maps for new beginnings. The story went viral. It reached Sophia, who shared it on one of her social media accounts. And there, among the comments and likes, was Daniel's signature with a single sentence: "I always knew she was capable of transforming pain into learning. I'm happy that now the world knows it too." Clara read the comment days later. She smiled. It confirmed that, even without a happy ending between them, there was something greater than their shared story, the impact they had left on each other's lives. And more than that, the impact each of them was leaving on the world. The betrayal, which for so long had seemed to be the defining moment of everything, was now just one chapter among many. The pain, the anger, the grief, all of it had fueled Clara to become a better person, more attentive, more empathetic. She finally understood that losing Daniel didn't destroy her, it awakened her. And even though I couldn't go back and retrace my steps, I could choose what to do with the ones that came before. It was on a random afternoon, after a lecture she gave at a public school, that she met Raphael. A photographer involved in art and education projects, she was watching her talk as part of the event's coverage. Their eyes met between slides, and what began as a shy compliment turned into a long conversation about books, choices, and scars. Raphael was different. He didn't try to impress. He was sincere, direct, someone who valued the present without needing to delve into the past. In their subsequent meetings, there was no rush, but there was a naturalness Clara hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she didn't feel she had to prove anything or hide anything. She told her story calmly, without embellishment, and saw in his eyes not judgment, but understanding. The moral dilemma that haunted her, do I deserve to start over after hurting someone, began to dissolve. Raphael saw her not as the woman who betrayed, but as the woman who learned, who looked in the mirror, who rebuilt herself. It was as if he saw everything Daniel once saw, but now Clara could see it too. For the first time, she was not only truly loved, but also loved herself honestly. And that changed everything. They began seeing each other frequently. They talked about art, literature, education, and real life. She felt free, not in the sense of being free from commitment, but in the deeper sense, of being able to be whole, without fear. She knew she was ready to love again, and this time, she would do it slowly, carefully, and truly. Time passed, and life took on a different rhythm. Daniel got married, and Clara wasn't invited, as expected. But she saw discreet photos and felt proud to have been part of his journey, even if fate had taken a different path. Raphael and Clara continued building something beautiful, but still far from labels or promises. And it was there, in that new chapter still being written, that Clara realized the greatest truth of all: it's not betrayal that defines who we are, but what we choose to do with what comes after it. And deep down, this was what she wanted to convey to others. That everyone makes mistakes. That some mistakes are costly. That sometimes we lose what we loved most. But if we are able to face the pain, learn from it, and move forward with humility, we may not recover what we lost, but we become worthy of something new, something born not of perfection, but of the courage to continue. And that was her choice. To continue. Not to erase the past, but to honor it. Because it shaped her. And shaped by it, she moved on. More aware, stronger, and finally, at peace. In the following months, the paths taken by each of those involved in that story reached points that seemed impossible to foresee at the beginning. Life, with its silent and relentless way of correcting course, gave each character not the ending they wanted, but the one they deserved, or perhaps, what they needed to finally understand the consequences of choices made when the heart stumbles and the character falls silent. Clara, now more mature and present in herself than ever before, remained grounded and focused on what she could still build. Raphael, patient and attentive, walked beside her without demanding promises, without comparing what they were experiencing with what she had left behind. But there was something in Clara that still pulsed, not as pain, but as an anchor of memory. A last conversation she never had the courage to initiate. And it was on a quiet afternoon, in front of a box she was saving to donate, that she found the notebook where Daniel used to jot down loose ideas, phrases, thoughts. She didn't know why she still kept it, but as she flipped through the pages and found simple notes like, "Don't let love become routine," or, "She still smiles when she looks at my coffee," she felt an almost childish urge to cry. But she didn't. She simply hugged the notebook as if silently giving thanks. The love she'd experienced was no longer hers, but it had shaped her forever. Daniel, for his part, was going through a delicate transition. After marrying Sophia, they faced an unexpected crisis. Nothing related to the past or Clara, but to the fact that, even when one loves serenely, there are pains that don't belong to the couple and need to be resolved individually. Sophia, in a moment of personal fragility, was dealing with her father's sudden death and plunged into a deep mourning that temporarily distanced her from the life around her. Daniel, accustomed to being someone's harbor, tried to be hers too, but realized that love, sometimes, can't save the other from themselves. The relationship endured, but didn't emerge unscathed. Sophia isolated herself. She needed time. And Daniel, respecting this, remained, but silent, as if understanding that not every absence is a lack of love, sometimes, it's survival. In this process, he rediscovered within himself a kind of solitude he hadn't experienced in a long time. The emotional maturity he had achieved over the years no longer allowed for desperate demands. He waited. He cared. He suffered in silence, but with dignity. And meanwhile, a new dilemma unexpectedly presented itself to Clara. Raphael received a proposal for an international art and education project that would keep him away for over a year. It was the chance of a lifetime, and she knew it. When he told her, his eyes were bright, but also filled with fear. He was afraid she would ask him to stay. Clara, however, said nothing that might stop him. On the contrary. She told him he had to go. That she would be there when he returned, not out of obligation, but because she admired him too much to prevent him from blossoming. Raphael left 2 months later. And Clara, once again, found herself alone. But this time, she didn't feel abandoned or left behind. She felt whole, like someone who has learned to be with herself without losing herself. Distance made her focus even more on social projects, and during one of these initiatives, she was invited to speak at an educational conference on how literature can teach ethics and empathy in schools. It was at this event, before dozens of educators, that she shared part of her journey, no names, no intimate details, but with the raw truth of someone who has made mistakes and chosen not to hide. At the end of the talk, she was approached by an older woman with a serene expression and eyes full of stories. It was Daniel's mother. Clara felt her heart race. She didn't know what to expect. But the woman simply held her hands and said she forgave. That time had done its work. That she, too, had made many mistakes in her youth, and that today she only wanted to see everyone at peace. Clara couldn't say anything. She just cried. A silent, restrained cry, but full of liberation. Daniel's mother said goodbye with a kiss on the forehead and said, "Be happy, my daughter. For yourself. Not for anyone else." That night, Clara walked home alone. And for the first time, she didn't feel like seeing Daniel or Raphael again, or rewriting a single line of what she'd experienced. She felt the cycle had finally ended. In the morning, she called her mother and told her about the encounter. They cried together. Their relationship had healed over time, and now they were friends, accomplices, women who had experienced loss but chose to continue loving, despite it all. Daniel, on the other hand, after months of waiting, decided he could no longer live on pause in Sophia's life. One day, he sat down with her and told her he loved her but needed to move on. Sophia understood. She cried. He apologized for not being there. She said she still loved him but needed some time alone. He didn't insist. They hugged for a long time, as if saying goodbye to a life that couldn't blossom. And, once again, Daniel moved on. But now without fear. Without guilt. Only with the conviction that some people don't stay, not for lack of love, but because their time is different. Months passed. Raphael returned to the country. Clara met him again. They talked, kissed, laughed. But he, too, had changed. She was different now. And even with immense affection between them, they realized that time and distance had done their work. There was no resentment, but there was also no desire to start over. Clara hugged him and said, "Thank you for teaching me that I was still capable of love." He replied, "Thank you for letting me go." And so, another story ended, without pain, but with maturity. Daniel, a year later, decided to move to another city and start new projects. Clara, in turn, published a book with real and fictional stories about loss, choices, and new beginnings. The book's title was simple, The Weight of Choices. The launch was a success. She received messages from people who saw themselves between the lines of her words. And one of these messages, from an anonymous profile, simply read, "Your pain became hope for me. Thank you." Clara smiled. She knew that, somehow, she had fulfilled the role life had given her after all. Transforming into a voice what had previously been just a silent cry. The true love that once existed between Daniel and Clara never ceased. It simply changed form. It was no longer romantic love. It was a gentle longing, an eternal respect, a learning experience that they would both carry until the end. They never saw each other in person again, but they knew about each other through third parties. And one cold night, both of them, in different places, opened Clara's book and read the last paragraph, where she wrote, "Some people destroy us, others build us, but there are those rare ones who do both at the same time, and those are impossible to forget." If you've made it this far, you've certainly felt everything this story conveys. Comment below what touched you most about this journey and how you see the weight of choices in our lives. Also, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next impactful stories we'll tell here. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, it destroys invested time, it destroys respect, and, most importantly, it destroys our self-image. Sometimes forgiveness comes. Sometimes not even that. But the damage always leaves a mark. That's why our channel doesn't support any kind of betrayal. Here, we believe that love is a daily choice. And if you're going to destroy someone, don't let it be the one who gave you their all. Choose to love truly. Choose not to betray. Choose not to lose what you may never find again.